Welcome classic rock fans and welcome Patreons to an episode of Beneath the Covers. It's been a while since I've done one of these, and today I want to look at the Doors' Strange Days from 1967. There's no doubt that the songs on this album, very much like the first album, are tracks that the band had been kicking about for a couple of years. The critic Robert Christgau describes this record as muscular but misshapen. Of course, the debut has Break On Through in the end and the sprawling flamenco of Light My Fire. But likewise, this one has that apocalyptic When the Music's Over and the drug-fueled miasma and paranoia of People Are Strange. And there's certain similarities between the material as well. It's almost as if it could feel like a continuation of the debut album as far as I'm concerned. And you try discerning the difference between, the intro to Soul Kitchen to When the Music's Over. What is interesting about this record, the Doors' music in general, and specifically the cover taken by Joel Brodsky, is that it embraces for me notions of the carnivalesque and the distinctly uncanny. Of course, Mikhail Bakhtin and his theory of the carnivalesque, something that subverts and liberates in a respect, undermines established authority by humour and mocking and subverting established norms. That is part of the thesis. He didn't actually smoke, by the way. And there's a famous quote, I don't know who said it, that there's nothing that established power hates more than to be mocked or laughed at. There were stories in the 18th and 19th century of public execution, those ultimate displays of state power against an errant individual would be subverted by the thronging crowds who would almost create a carnivalesque or carnival atmosphere, very mocking out. Even those that took the platform themselves to die would sometimes play up to the crowd. Of course, Joel Brodsky is no stranger to this band. He took those famous photographs of the shirtless Jim Morrison, pictures that have adorned the walls of student dorms for decades. Apparently, the use of street performers on this album cover was a reference to Fellini's 1954 film La Strada. Morrison, being a student of film at UCLA, would probably appreciate this allusion. It also employs elements of the surreal and the vaudevillian, which very much, in my mind, summarises kind of where the band were coming from with those first 2 or 3 albums. The idea was to shoot, photograph some street performers in New York, and of course it includes a juggler, a trumpet player, a dwarf, and some acrobats. What this album cover does is it communicates a sense of movement. It perfectly accompanies the swirling psychedelia, dark psychedelia of the music contained thereon, along with those organ textures and, as I've said, those European vaudevillian tones that we even got on the first album, all topped off by the cherry that is Jim Morrison's mewing, apart from that apocalyptic yowl we get at the end of When the Music's Over. In terms of the actual performers used, Joel Brodsky has gone on to say that it was only the acrobats that were professionals, the rest of them were this potpourri of amateurs with day jobs. The juggler used on the cover is Frank Colleghi, I think that's how you say his name, I'm not sure, but he was actually Brodsky's assistant who couldn't actually juggle. The dwarves were twins, one who appears on the cover, one on the back, were not very cooperative because they considered themselves actors and didn't want to participate in what they perceived as modelling work. Brodsky apparently grew continuously irked by them, often referring to them as Santa's elves, not very politically correct. And the weightlifter was actually a friend of Brodsky's who had been introduced to, apparently. He goes on to describe the chaos of this photo shoot with the dwarves sitting in the strongman's lap, smoking cigars, and with them commandeering passers-by. In fact, the trumpet player is a taxi driver, which they paid $5 to pose in this photograph. In fact, he's still wearing his own hat. And all the while, there is this ghostly presence of the band that stare out over the proceedings from a poster on the wall. A kind of ghostly observation of an observation. And let's not forget that this photo shoot came about due to Jim Morrison's refusal to have his photograph taken for the cover. Strange Days was released in September 1967 on the Elektra label, of course. It reached number 3 in the US charts, I believe. Robert Christgau once more describes the record as it has all the power and energy of the first LP, but is more subtle, more intricate, and much more effective. Other people have disagreed with that, seeing the second album as a slight dropping off, slightly weaker than the first. I personally feel they make for perfect companion pieces. Apparently in 1966, Paul Rothchild and Bruce Botnick managed to secure an 8-track machine The band were quite inspired by receiving a pre-release copy of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and feel they needed to perhaps up the ante or lay a marker down themselves. Of course, this 8-track machine allowed the band to experiment with all sorts of strange, different array of instrumentation. I personally think the music on this album is absolutely sensational, very much like the debut. In fact, one critic has described when the music's over as being like a Greek tragedy, all building up to that cathartic explosion at the end. But we can't get past the cover. The cover very much defines this album. It's and renders it a rather strange oddity. Sets it apart from what was going on at the time. Jim Morrison was perhaps right to insist that he wasn't photographed for the album cover. I even read some of the early copies of this album came with a sticker assuring would-be purchasers that although the band do not feature on the cover, they can sure be found in the music contained on this album, or some words to that effect. Anyway, you've been watching an episode of Beneath the Covers. Of course, the featured album was Strange Days by the Doors. Anyway, I will leave you, as I always do, by saying I hope you are well, staying safe, looking forward to Christmas, but always that you keep listening.